Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Josh Hutcherson has to survive 5 Nights at Freddy's in the long-awaited video game adaptation. Security guard Mike Schmidt, played by Josh Hutcherson, is struggling to hold down a job and keep custody of his younger sister Abby, played by Piper Rubio, from their Aunt Jane, played by Mary Stuart Masterson. After visiting his career counsellor Steve Raglan, played by Matthew Lillard, Mike gets a job at the long-abandoned family entertainment centre Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. There he discovers the restaurant harbours dark secrets related to the animatronics and may be connected to the disappearance of his brother many years ago. The 5 Nights at Freddy's game series has been hugely successful ever since it launched in 2014, but it's been a very long road for it to cross over onto cinema screens, having been stuck in development hell for many years. At one point Warner Bros was working on it, then the rights crossed over to Blumhouse. Chris Columbus, the director of Home Alone and the first 2 Harry Potter movies, was attached to it. 2 years ago he dropped out. In his place, Emma Tammy stepped into the director's chair. Previously known for horror indies like The Wind, she co-wrote the screenplay along with Scott Cawthon, the game's creator, who is heavily involved in this film version. Now, I will fully admit that I have never played 5 Nights at Freddy's, but I know it by cultural osmosis, and also by the fact that not one, but 2 movies actually beat it to the screen. 5 Nights has spent so long in development that it's actually been ripped off twice before it appears on screen. It's late to its own party. There was the Banana Splits movie, which rumour has it alleges that was the 5 Nights script that Warner Bros had, and they just replaced the characters with the Hanna-Barbera ones. But also you got Nicolas Cage in Willy's Wonderland, where he played a silent protagonist facing off against animatronics in an old abandoned restaurant. Sounds very familiar. I actually quite liked Willy's Wonderland. I was much less enamoured with the Banana Splits movie, but certainly that shows just how much you can do with the concept. And rather depressingly, 5 Nights at Freddy's, the actual movie, is worse than both of them. Yeah, imagine that. Imagine that the actual movie is actually less than the 2 movies that ripped off the premise. And yet, here we are. Probably the biggest positive out of the entire movie is the production design, or at least in terms of replicating the IP. The movie clearly takes a lot of inspiration from the 3rd game in particular, especially in terms of certain details about its plotting, but definitely you can tell that a lot of time has been spent on trying to replicate the exact look and feel of the games visually, and that's especially true of the animatronics. It is very abundantly clear when you're watching the movie that the majority of the film's $20 million budget, to put that in perspective, that's 4 times the budget of Willy's Wonderland, went primarily on all the animatronics, which were provided by the Jim Henson Company. Instead of using CGI, they decided to opt for actual puppetry, and that is definitely the best decision that they made out of the entire movie, because those animatronics look fantastic. They look great. They look very accurate to their game counterparts. I think in terms of that, game fans will be exceptionally satisfied with the movie. It looks exactly how you would imagine a 5 Nights at Freddy's movie would look. However, using animatronics does have limitations, and that's very abundantly clear when you're watching the movie. The animatronics don't actually move a lot of the time. In fact, when they do move, it's usually in jump cuts, or usually by cutting away and they're just popping up behind characters so that they don't have to move them in the frame a lot of the time. And when they do have to move, you'll notice that the editing has to work around the fact that they can't do continuous actions. They can't do 2 actions in the same shot, for example. It has to be action 1, cut away, action 2, cut away. and so on and so forth. And so that does limit what the animatronics can actually do in the movie. That's the trade-off you have for having big physical props on set, but it means that there is actually something for the actors to react to rather than just having big CGI creations played by men in green suits. Unfortunately, that's where most of the positives stop for me. I was frankly astonished at just how much of a nothing movie this is. It feels like the project has spent so long in development that the filmmakers gave up on any ambitions other than just getting it across the finish line. Well, congratulations, Five Nights at Freddy's does exist as a movie that runs just under an hour and 50 minutes, but that's about it. It just exists, and it has a whole load of completely baffling decisions, especially when it comes to the screenplay. I know it isn't a first draft because they've been working on it for 8 years, but it feels like something that they wrote in a weekend. It just doesn't make any sense on any level whatsoever, and I'm not talking about the game lore and things like that, and I'm sure that loads of fans of the game will go, well, that thing's related to that thing, and that thing's related to that thing. Don't care. It should work on its own as a movie, and as a movie onto itself, you just find yourself going, why exactly did they do it this way? Why did they pad this whole film out with a whole bunch of convoluted subplots that actually have very little to do with the animatronics that are meant to be the main focus of the movie? It's clear that obviously they wanted to take the heat off those animatronics that can barely move because they need to pad out the rest of the story. Yes, they need to flesh out the protagonist character because it's a movie, not a video game where you're actually playing as the protagonist, but I just found myself going, why exactly did they give this backstory to Josh Hutcherson's character where he's a security guard, but he also has a brother that was kidnapped many years ago, and he's devoted to trying to find his brother, and to do this, he essentially lucid dreams. Yeah, I'm not kidding here. Every night, he attempts to have the same dream to essentially flashback to when his brother was abducted, because he wants to try and find clues to who abducted him in his dreams, which, when you say it out loud, sounds kinda stupid. And it is. He goes around every night looking at a poster of Nebraska and listening to nature sounds to try and bring him back into this moment. I don't know what this actually accomplishes, because I hate to tell him this, but dreams are not really reliable in terms of investigation. It could put any old thing in your head, and it turns out that's exactly what happens because the animatronics start invading his dreams. Somehow. Yes, the animatronics start invading his dreams like they're Freddy Krueger. The movie just keeps playing out the same dream sequence over and over again with very slight permutations and imparting very little new info to the audience. Much of it is just him chasing around the spirits of these kids, trying to get them to tell him something about his brother's disappearance, which they do eventually after an awfully long time waiting. You do actually start to see the subplot connect with the main plot of the movie through sheer absolute contrivance, but these dream sequences are completely inert. There's no tension or atmosphere or suspense built up in them. They're not scary in the slightest. They should be strange and surreal in some way, and they aren't. And clearly the filmmakers are aware of just how completely unscary these scenes are, because they end several of them with the animatronics just slashing him in his dreams, which makes no sense in the slightest, aside from providing a jump scare, because in reality, the animatronics seemingly have no interest in him for the majority of the movie, and also, it doesn't make sense for their plans to start attacking him, especially because, for some weird reason, the wounds start appearing in real life. I guess they are Freddy Krueger. But there isn't just one nonsensical subplot in the movie, there's two, because we also have the one with the aunt, played by Mary Stuart Marston, who is clearly meant to be a leopard print Karen. Okay, her character's name is actually Jane, but clearly that was where the thinking lay. Jane wants custody of Mike's little sister that he's been the guardian of ever since their mother died. Apparently the filmmakers understood that much of the older audience remembers that Hutcherson was a child star about 15 years ago. We're not ready to accept him as a daddy just yet. But also the aunt is trying to scheme around him. His babysitter is actually working for the aunt, trying to dig up anything to work for her in the custody battle, but she's kind of struggling, so she hires a bunch of goons to attack Freddy's to try and get him fired. And this whole subplot is just ridiculous. It has no business being in the movie, and the only reason it's there is to have a bunch of extra characters that can be killed off in the middle of the movie. It has so little with what's actually going on that Mike never finds out about the fact that his babysitter was actually spying on him the whole time. That never comes up. It's all completely forgotten, and that's the hilarious thing about this subplot. Virtually everything about it is almost immediately discarded the moment it's off screen. A bunch of characters die, they all completely disappear for the majority of the movie. Hardly anyone mentions them. When they disappear at Freddy's, the aunt doesn't have a scene where she's wondering where the hell they've got to or why they haven't messed up the place properly like they were supposed to. No, she just disappears from the movie for an extended period of time. Random, unnecessary plot holes just inserted into the narrative. And Mary Stuart Marston is way too good for this kind of role. It feels like she probably spent much of her time between takes going, I was in Benny and June. Do you remember Fried Green Tomatoes? How did I end up playing the secondary human antagonist in a Five Nights at Freddy's movie? No one in the audience cares about this character, and the only reason it's in the screenplay is because for the first 2/3 of the running time, there is no conflict in the story aside from this character. And even the filmmakers can't even bother to pretend that they care about this subplot, because the only reason that you would write a wicked aunt character into a horror movie is so you can get their richly deserved comeuppance and the audience cheers at it. And then the movie doesn't even deliver on that. It happens off screen. And then the moment it cuts away, the movie just completely forgets about it, even though it's a glaring plot hole in the ending. Bravo! Fantastic writing. Great job, team. And all this unnecessary junk is in the movie because otherwise, without it, it'd be even more frighteningly barren than it already is. I don't think that Five Nights is a particularly hard game to bring to film, in that you just pull from the game's narrative and incorporate some of its gameplay mechanics in some of the tension sequences. That's all you have to do. It's a survival game, after all. You gotta go around fulfilling certain tasks and try not to get attacked and jump scared. I think that pretty much writes itself as a horror film, but this screenplay makes it difficult on itself because it incorporates virtually none of it. Willy's Wonderland does a better job of replicating the Five Nights gameplay mechanic in its movie than the mainline Five Nights film does in its own adaptation. And instead, in its place, it replaces it with nothing. Absolutely nothing. The first act of the movie is laboriously stretched out as we're introduced to Mike, and then he gets hired for the job, and then he goes to the restaurant and he wanders around for a bit, and then he finds the animatronics and he gets introduced to their whole deal. This is the lever you have to pull every so often, yada yada yada. It's all these bricks of exposition. Almost an hour passes in the movie before anything actually scary happens in it past the pre-title sequence. Aside from that, almost nothing happens for a very long period of time. There's no attempt to build mood or atmosphere in these scenes. It's just characters just reciting the game's backstory to crushingly boring degrees. It certainly doesn't help that Hutcherson is one of the least compelling main characters in a horror movie I've seen in quite some time. He spends the entire movie looking like he's on the verge of a nap, and I know the character is meant to be sleep deprived, but even so, there's meant to be some level of charisma or personality about the character, aside from, my brother was kidnapped 20 years ago. At least have a little bit of fright when the animatronics are trying to attack you at points. And then you contrast that with Elizabeth Lail's performance as the cop Vanessa, who is giving him all these helpful hints, which is overplayed by comparison, because she spends a lot of her early scenes going, I'm going to say a creepy thing, just offhandedly. What was that? oh, nothing, just signalling the fact this character has some kind of twist about it, almost like she's got a big neon sign over the top of her head. It's such an unsubtle performance that even people who haven't played the games know that there's something up with this character way in advance of when it's actually revealed. It's ridiculous how badly the film fumbles that, and I know that a lot of the core audience will already know it, but the movie has to work for people who haven't played the games as well, and it's not shocking for them. But the movie's biggest cardinal sin is that it's just so boring to watch. It does nothing with the games at all. It does nothing interesting with it, and it builds no suspense. It's just Hutcherson wandering around dark corridors for extended periods of time. The animatronics aren't really hunting him for most of the movie. They don't care about him a lot of the time. In fact, they care so little about him that he spends several nights of this movie lying at his desk, asleep, having those extended dream sequences. Those are your 5 Nights at Freddy's, a nice long nap. There you go. Survive that, why don't ya? And yes, I'm aware it's a PG-13 movie, or at least I am now. Going into it, I wasn't, because the movie has a 15 certificate in the UK, which means that anyone under the age of 15 cannot attend, which has locked out many of the younger Five Nights fans from seeing it in the UK. But I was thinking, because it shares the rating with Willy's Wonderland, it's more on that kind of level, maybe not on the 18 rated Banana Splits movie, which was very heavy on the gore. And as I understand it, Five Nights has never been really about all the gru, but it is very obvious that the movie is cutting away very quickly to avoid anything really bloody happening on screen, and so it feels very tame and anemic most of the time. But you know the one thing that PG-13 horror movies can do really well? Jump scares. And that's the thing that everyone knows Five Nights at Freddy's for. Jump scares everywhere. You would think they would be all over this movie. Curiously though, they aren't. There is a notable lack of jump scares in a Five Nights at Freddy's movie, which might be the only place where you'd accept a bajillion jump scares happening. In fact, the most jump scares in the movie is a little tiny mascot toy that keeps popping up in lockers, accompanied with a loud stinger sound. And most of the other jump scares come from the cupcake animatronic, which is the only animatronic that seems to actually do anything over the course of the movie. And I understand the movie has a difficult time balancing maybe those younger Five Nights fans who have come into horror through those games and maybe aren't ready for a full-on experience, but also the expectations of genre fans, but it barely even tries. You spend much of this movie, which is meant to be a haunted house ride, going, where are the scares? Where are the bits I'm supposed to jump at? I saw this with a mostly teenage crowd, and they were amped up, ready to be scared. They were jumping at doors opening, for crying out loud. They'd psyched themselves up that much, and I think even they came away disappointed. You would think it would try and jolt you as many times as it can, because that was all the stuff the games did. It was cheap jump scares, the video game series. But for some reason, there's no gore, there's no scares. All we have to really take our attention away from the absence of virtually anything that makes a good horror movie is Matthew Lure's fairly brief performance in the film, who completely understands just how ridiculous the assignment is and just attacks the scenery with gusto. And occasionally the cameo from an odd YouTuber that I've never heard of. Look, there's two kinds of people in this world. There are people that know what a matpat is, and those that live their lives thankful and don't really care. Oh look, he said the thing, he said the catchphrase! Who gives a rat's ass? And what would have made it tolerable is at least embracing the camp of the premise, but instead the movie is so serious about itself. It seriously thinks it says something about the poisoning of childhood nostalgia with this subplot about Mike's brother getting kidnapped. No one cares about it. No one went into this movie wanting that kind of stuff. They came for the animatronics, and they hardly do anything for the majority of the movie, and the one scene I can remember them from is some bizarre fort building montage. Again, that's how little threat they pose in the movie. There's a fort building montage in it! Let's be clear, I had no expectations of this movie. It's a game series I've never played, after all, so all I asked for going into it was to be fun. That's all I wanted. That would maybe be a little bit better than Willy's Wonderland and the Banana Splits movie. That's not too high of a bar to clear. The fact it managed to limbo underneath that is an impressive feat. Five Nights at Freddy's, the movie, is tedious, incoherent, it makes no sense whatsoever. There's dangling plot threads in the script. It's not scary, there's no mood, there's no tension, there's no atmosphere. It's a McDonald's hamburger of a horror movie. It is completely bland. Yeah, if you're a 13-year-old and this is your first horror movie, you might get a little bit jolted by it, but anyone who has watched anything even slightly harder than this won't feel anything at all other than just crushing boredom. I don't understand how they've managed to muck this up so badly. The fact that it's managed to be successful over the weekend has nothing to do with the quality of the movie and everything to do with the strength of the brand and the fact that people love the brand so much, especially young kids and teenagers. That's where the success story is. The film, however, is easily one of my contenders for one of the worst movies of the year. It is embarrassingly bad, and worse, it's lazy, because all it does is just get the IP on screen. They just did that and got the production design correct and went, that's our work done, pretty much. Get it on there for about 2 hours and release it in cinemas. Survive Five Nights at Freddy's? I thought I was going to fall asleep. If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page or with YouTube's Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video. You can find all the other places you can support me at my Linktree page, or you can power my backup generator at my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, or you can simply just like, share and subscribe. It all helps. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.